And this is the story of a C-119 aircraft flying out of Minneapolis from the 96th Tactical Airlift Squadron. This is the most dramatic event I've ever experienced or read about that did not terminate in a fatal accident. I kept a log of special squadron events from 1967 and 1969. However, this record has been lost for 25 years. Time interacts with your memory that distorts events, but what follows are the notes taken 24 hours after return to Minneapolis. Returned yesterday from a 4-day cross-country from the 13th to the 16th of February 1969. The trip went from Minneapolis to Ramey in Puerto Rico to Homestead to Fort Worth, returned Minneapolis. The crew consisted of John Kump, aircraft commander, Rocky Elton, co-pilot, Hank Speak, navigator, Oscar Schulberg, navigator, Gary Marsden, navigator, Don Carna, instructor loadmaster, Ray Turnquist, loadmaster, Jose Alberio, instructor engineer, and Norm Lester, engineer. The trip was uneventful until tracking 343 degrees out of Vero Beach, Florida to intercept Victor 3 from Navy Jacksonville. We were talking to Jacksonville Center. The weather briefing had precluded our planned overwater across the Gulf of Mexico. They recommended a flight up the east coast and around the top of bad weather system moving from west to east. We were between layers and VFR on top, in and out of it, and experiencing light to moderate turbulence and light rain. An aircraft called in north of us at 6,000 feet reporting light to heavy rain and light to moderate turbulence, and so we pressed on. Suddenly, we were hit without warning with torrential rain, like a fire hose on a windscreen, and experienced severe turbulence. Everything not tied down was adrift and floating. We had all our passengers secured, and were prepared for weather penetration. Wing and tail heat was on, pitot heat was on, windshield defrost was on, but no carburetor heat. We had 2,200 RPM, 100 pounds of torque. We dropped from 6,000 to 2,000 feet. After application of full power, we yo-yoed back to 6,000 feet and then down again, and then finally settled down at 13,000 MSL. It took us 30 minutes to descend. Aircraft was over a red line throughout, although the throttles were retarded to 28 inches of mercury. Weather was so heavy, only our IFF saved us on a scope at Patrick Approach Control Center. Miami Center had been knocked off the air. We attempted to do a 180 and get out of the turbulence, but we did a 360 plus a 180 because the aircraft was pretty much uncontrollable. I remember them identifying us as the uncontrollable aircraft in the area. When loose of the worst part of the storm, we were inbound from 50 miles out to sea. We had been 50 miles overland, proceeding west-northwest. We were redline in airspeed, but eased her down to 10,000 feet, indicating 200 knots. Approach informed us we had been stationary for 4 minutes. All our gyros were out. The directional gyro was spinning. RMIs were unreliable. The attitude indicator was goofy. We got a no gyro approach from a Patrick GCA. The Tech Sergeant Center was our final controller. At 1,500 feet and 12 miles, Patrick Air Force Base informed us that they were below minimums. We asked for an alternate and were given Kinley Naval Air Station in Bermuda or Ramey Air Force Base in Puerto Rico. We continued our approach, and the sky again turned very dark, and we entered heavy rain. At 1,200 feet and a mile visibility, the field came up to 300.5, with strong crosswinds gusting to 50 miles per hour. Navy Super Connie made a missed approach as we continued with our no gyro. Crew members lying on the floor looking down for the runway called out the surf, the shore, the high lines, the highway, the overrun, and then the runway angling off about 45 degrees to the left. We had a 45-degree crab angle in, but we're right on center line, and we accomplished a non-eventful landing. On the runway, it took both of us to hold the yoke, and the tower informed us to use caution as we were obscured by rain. We couldn't see the turnoff, much less the taxiway, so we shut down on the runway, and I believe we went to the bar before we went to quarters. The next day, we proceeded to fly the 1,215 miles to MSP with minimum nav equipment. Slave gyros and RMIs were out, so We used a CD-249 needle and a magnetic compass, and the navigators did their job. Back at Minneapolis, the aircraft C-119 AF25914 was observed to have wrinkled skin and twisted plates, and the fluxgate compass had been torn loose from its mounting. These are my notes, shaky as they might be, of that roller coaster in the sky back in 1969. It is my plan to send a copy of this letter to each of the crew members and get a response back, and then rewrite this story for a final comment on that fateful day. Letter from Jose Alberio, 22 December 1994. How can I ever forget what happened on that flight? After takeoff and climb to cruise, student flight engineer Norm Lester sat in the flight engineer's seat for training. Everything was routine, an occasional bump and in and out of clouds. Without any warning, we entered some heavy torrential precipitation and moderate turbulence. The rain was so intense that it was leaking all over the flight deck. Water was dripping onto the crew and dripping from the overhead circuit breaker and electrical control panels. Water was everywhere. I informed the aircraft commander that I was going to the back to check the cargo compartment and check things out. Norm was still flying the engineer's seat. I took my parachute with me as a precautionary measure. Once in the back, I had to sit down immediately and tighten the seatbelt. Everybody in the back was already secured. What was not tightly tied down was jumping all over the cargo compartment. Fruit and vegetables that we had bought on the previous day at Homestead, Florida. It was the wildest ride of my life. I thought that the airplane would break up. I prepared to meet my Creator. After the severe turbulence was over, I climbed back to the flight deck and looked out and saw that we were over water some 50 miles over the Atlantic. I don't remember much else except on final approach we were all over the sky, and I was lying on the floor trying to get sight of the ground and the runway. We finally got the field in sight and made an uneventful landing. Jose Alberio, flight engineer. Letter received December 29, 1994 from Major Speak. Hi, Rock. The mission was a 3-day over water, weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. The reason we stayed out 4 days was due to the thunderstorm. We entered like a bunch of idiots. The mission was an upgrade for Marsden and a check ride for Solberg. We operated that day out of Homestead Air Force Base. I was in the back to check with Solberg about something and returned to the flight deck and saw that the thunderstorm dead ahead. I spoke with John Kumpf and asked what he was doing. He replied he was going to have a look. At that I replied, you don't take a look in a C-119. I sat down in a jump seat and strapped in as tight as I could and held on with my white knuckles. The rest was pretty much as you've written, except I had us going into the cloud at 10,000 feet, where the storm picked us up by the tail and threw us 50 miles out to sea. At that time, Jacksonville Center had us at zero airspeed, at 14,000 feet. That's about all I recall. If you need any more info, drop me a line or call. Your old friend and buddy, Hank. Letter also dated December 29, 1994 from Oscar Schulberg, navigator. Rocky, how can anyone ever forget that flight? On that leg of the trip, I was not in the front. Of the navs, I think Gary Marsden and Hank Speak were up front. Consequently, I can't add anything to the flight details. Needless to note, the oranges and grapefruit and everything else not tied down was flying all over the cargo compartment. Those of us in the cargo compartment had a difficult time strapping on our parachutes without getting tossed all over the airplane ourselves. I don't remember anything else unusual in the cargo compartment, but I remember that in spite of the weather, it was a damn good landing you made, Rock. So long, your friend Oscar. Letter dated 1 February 1995 from Norm Lester, Springbrook, Wisconsin. Dear Rocky, in regards to your letter and phone call, I will try to put down what I can remember of what happened. I cannot add much to what you have already got down, except you had no carb heat. But I remember that when we entered the heavy rain, I turned the heat up full hot, as I could not set it up the way it was supposed to be set because of the turbulence. I also remember that when we landed, Jose and I pulled some panels and inspected the wing bolt brackets and the horizontal stabilizer bolts. We also placed the aircraft on a red X. As I recall, John or you called home the next morning, and John, as aircraft commander, was authorized to downgrade the red X to a red dash for a one-time flight home. Upon return to Minnesota, it was placed back on a red X. Later, it was inspected and tested by a private corporation pilot and returned to service. As I recall, John was talking to Patrick Air Force Base, and they said Homestead was closed due to weather and advised us to go to Puerto Rico, which John informed them was out of the question because it did not have enough fuel, and that we were coming back into Patrick regardless of conditions. When told that Patrick was closed and asked what his intentions were, John Kumpf said, "I intend to fly this pig over the first piece of land, and the entire crew is going to bail out." With that, they decided to try to help us get into Patrick. If you recall, we had bought some fruit and tomatoes somewhere along the line, and when we landed, all that was left of the tomatoes was the skins. I remember sitting in the engineer's seat and watching the rain come in around the windshield and hit you in the face as you were fighting controls. I remember you biting off the stem of your pipe. I remember seeing you have the ailerons full left or full right as required, and there was hardly any response from the airplane. We would just keep rolling over. I watched the airspeed go past the red line to about 240 knots, and remember looking at the wings to see if any sheet metal was coming off. I do believe, if my memory serves me right, that you or John bought the Air Force Tech Sergeant controller a steak supper at the NCO Club that evening. This is about all I can recall. As you said, it's been a long time. I'm glad that all the boys are still alive and well, because they certainly should not be. It was nice hearing from you and some of the bunch from the old days. It was a really great group of people. Your friend, Norm Lester. This is the second letter from John Kumpf, dated February 5th, 1995. Dear Rocky, please accept my apologies for not responding sooner in regard to the saga of our incredible ride in a C-119 26 years ago. In retrospect, the experience was indeed incredible because we survived, and I suspect at the time we were consumed with feelings of macho or bravado or controlled shock. Perhaps we were blasé, having walked away. After all, that's why we received our hazardous duty pay. I guess one of the most awesome post-impressions of the remarkable fact that the aircraft withstood such awful abuse without breaking apart. Although the C-119 was ugly and slow, it was exceptionally well built, contrary to the description of a lovely woman. Anyway, I'll try to recite the events of a long time ago to the best of my recollection, hopefully without exaggeration. However, my memory, which was never very good, has been distorted over time by other exciting experiences and diluted with an occasional sip of an alcoholic beverage. I am sure the basic reason for my involvement in the trip was because I was delinquent in the overwater requirement. I recall we were tasked to fly both a day and a night mission a few hundred miles over water every 6 months. This was primarily a requirement for the navigators, but someone had to drive the airplane. While they sharpened their skills at celestial navigation using the sextant and Loran long-range navigation equipment, the pilot tried to work the HF, high-frequency radio, an unreliable device at best, the trailing wire antenna, etc. My biggest problem was to keep from falling asleep. These kinds of missions were very boring, hours and hours of sheer boredom interrupted by moments of stark terror. Whoever coined that expression of flying most likely knew it happened eventually to anyone who trespassed the sanctity of space. The first segments of our weekend warrior jaunt was most likely uneventful, consisting of a Friday evening departure out of Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport heading south. The crew makeup was invariably determined 3 or 4 weeks in advance. In addition to a brief getaway from the severe Minnesota winters and the aforementioned training requirement called filling the squares, we were motivated by an opportunity to supplant our income and a chance to have some fun at the other end. Crew compatibility was a factor. We flew with the guys we liked. I wouldn't be surprised if every one of us had been reminded by a wife or a girlfriend of our pending absence on Valentines Day. They would love us even more on our return. Well, again, the following is reconstructed from my fuzzy memory. About mid-morning on Saturday, February 14th, 1969, we all met at base operations at Homestead Air Force Base, south of Miami, Florida. Our plan was to fly northwest across the Gulf of Mexico, either to New Orleans or Houston. I wanted to fly to Dallas to spend the Saturday evening with my twin brother who lived there. The crew had no problem with this. We had to RON somewheres. We would then return to Minneapolis sometime on Sunday. We were told of potentially severe weather over the Gulf and decided wisely not to go in that direction. This meant our overwater requirement would have to be delayed, but better judgment prevailed. Instead, we elected to head north along the east coast of Florida on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base outside of Dayton, Ohio. We'd spend the night there and then on to Minneapolis the following day. It was a beautiful day in South Florida, and the weather forecaster told us we could fly VFR, visual flight rules, halfway up the Florida coast. And he told us that we would not encounter anything we could not get through or around beyond that point. I should have known better. I had flown for 18 years by then, and the weather forecasters were wrong most of the time. We took off after briefing the rest of the crew about our change in plans. As I had done several times before on previous flights, I headed for the beach, flying on the deck just above the water and along the coastline, and it provided a spectacular view of the beaches and some of the most beautiful mansions in the world. The only obstacles were flights of seagulls or pelicans. We waved at the boats and the ships and the bikinis. Our pleasure trip was interrupted by deteriorating weather, necessitating an IFR, Instrument Flight Rules Flight Plan. Captain Burnham, Rocky Elton, and I was a major at that time, contacted Jacksonville Center and filed a flight plan through the radio. We were assigned a hard altitude of 5,000 and began tracking an airway heading north. The weather began closing in on us rapidly and conditions worsened. We were experiencing heavy rain, hail, severe turbulence, and lightning. We were gaining altitude in spite of my attempts to keep the aircraft level. I pulled the throttles back and pushed the wheel forward to no avail. Rocky called the center as we went from 5,000 feet to 6,000 feet to 7,000 feet. We continued to climb with the throttles all the way back. We would hear Jacksonville Center advising other aircraft in the area to climb or descend or to turn to get out of our way. I think at one point we were near 10,000 feet involuntarily. The navigators had given up. They had no idea of our position. Neither did the pilots. We were hanging on. I was losing control of the aircraft, which was being tossed around like a small craft in a tempest. It was undoubtedly the worst storm I'd ever encountered. I hollered for Rocky to help me hold on to the controls. Rocky was a former member of the University of Minnesota football team and the strongest SOB I ever knew. Rocky clamped his big paws on the wheel like a vice, and he really helped. To compound the mess we were in, the electrical inverters failed. Why not? Everything else had gone wrong. The inverters made the flight instruments work. Without them, our gyros began to tumble. Our compasses began to spin. We were back on basic instruments, needle, ball, and airspeed. This was how Charles Lindbergh flew the Atlantic. It was like flying with a carpenter's level. When the airspeed increased, we were descending, and when the airspeed dropped off, we were climbing. Simple, huh? But not so. The turbulence was unbelievable. Suddenly on guard channel, the radio emergency frequency being monitored, we heard a welcome voice. Air Force 25915, this is Patrick Air Force Base, GCA, ground control approach. And I think we have you on our radar scope. He gave us a code to squawk on our IFF, identification friend and foe, and instructed us to turn left and turn right. He came back on the radio with the greatest message I've ever heard. Air Force 25914, I have you on my radar. This will be a gyro out approach. Turn left now. From then on, he told us when to turn, what direction, when to roll out of the turn, and when to descend. Fortunately, the turbulence began to subside. I did not need Rocky's help with the controls anymore. He began working the radio about the only thing we didn't lose. It seemed like forever to get to Patrick. Our ground speed was like we were heading backwards. We were encountering very strong headwinds. I began breathing easier as we started a steady descent straight ahead with just a few slight turns in one direction or another to keep us on a direct path to Patrick Air Runway. The constant voice of the GCA operator was comforting and reassuring. The voice from below and afar talked us all the way down to touchdown. The field was below minimums for landing, but nobody cared. Our final approach was flown at a 30 to 40 degree heading to the right of the actual runway heading. The strong crosswind called for the crab that kept us on a straight flight path. I looked up at the last second and saw the runway and kicked out the crab. It seemed like we'd rolled just a few feet because of the wind speed. Our forward visibility was just a few feet. Although it was mid-afternoon, it was almost dark. We could not see the taxi off the runway, but it did not make any difference. No one was landing or taking off. Rain continued to batter the aircraft. The crew was quietly engrossed in their own thoughts and perhaps prayers of thanks. About that time I learned one of the airmen in back had broken his arm. He did not get strapped in when we first hit the turbulence and was thrown against the top of the bulkhead. It did turn out to be a break to the best of my recollection. Finally, a follow-me truck found us and led us to a parking place. We jumped into the vehicle. I turned to the driver with a request to go first to the radar trailer parked near the end of the runway. As I entered the darkened trailer, except for the lighted equipment and radar scopes, I was met by the world's greatest GCA operator. I damn near kissed him. I think I said something like, "You saved our lives." He showed us a Polaroid picture of the radar screen taken about the time he spotted us. There was the unmistakable hook radar return of a tornado, and next to it was the radar return of our aircraft IFF signal. We had unexplainably and inexplicably flown into a tornado, and we were tossed about 50 miles out to sea. The intense winds from the west had blown us that far off course. I do not remember much more. I suspect some of us found the officers' club and indulged ourselves with a strong drink or two. I was under the impression the aircraft was so badly stressed that it was left there. Did someone come from Minneapolis to pick us up the next day? What did we do wrong? Absolutely nothing. We were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Why did we survive? Professionalism, skill of the pilots, God was with us. Our number wasn't up. Arthur Godfrey once said, "When your number's up, your number's up. But I don't want to be on board an airplane when the pilot's number's up." I do not know the answer. In my nearly 20 years of flying at that time, mostly as a fighter pilot, I had survived a lot of close ones. None of them left such a lasting impression. It's impossible to describe the fury, wrath, and violence of that storm. We were near the Bermuda Triangle, but that's a myth, isn't it? Thanks, Rocky, for soliciting my input. Some of this may be apocryphal. Use what you like. I have no pride of authorship. I'd be happy to help edit your draft. In any event, I'm looking forward to the final version. If nothing else, it would make great reading for our grandkids someday. With warm regards and cheers, John E. Kumpf.
Rocky, I want to share with you my recollections of that eventful February trip from Homestead to wherever we were going. I was navigating and had the first-hand experience of an out-of-body experience, basically, because that weather that we hit on the way up the Florida Peninsula was nothing like I've ever experienced nor want to experience again. I was navigating, and it was kind of a ho-hum plan in that we were flying straight up Florida and then over, and we'd be home the following morning after spending the time in Puerto Rico. And all I remember is being blasted literally almost right out of the air with what turned out, I think, to be a tornado. And when the controller found us on the radar screen, in fact, he took a picture of it and showed us the hook. We were 50 miles out over the ocean. And my thoughts go like, hey, I remember you were smoking a pipe. It wasn't lit, but you had a pipe stem in your mouth and you bit right through that because the force that we were subjected to was so incredible with updrafts and downdrafts that it was absolutely like a yo-yo. I was strapped in and I couldn't reach my parachute like it would have done me any good anyway. But it was incredible to see us go up and down like a little yo-yo and from side to side. And fortunately, I've always thought, thank God you had those ham-hock forehands because you were able to hold onto that yoke and keep it somewhat stable. You know, the speed was God, I don't remember, but it was way over at the red line, and the water was coming in around the seals of the windows, and it was really an experience. I remember after we settled down, the controller calling and asking what our navigational intentions were, whether we had enough gas to go to Puerto Rico because Florida basically was closed and they didn't want to give us a vector back to Florida. And the only thing working was a whiskey compass because Loran was out and everything else. So thank God the SIF thing worked, where we had that selective identification feature, because that's the only way they could figure out who we were amongst all the heavy paint of the clouds. And that little blinking selective identification feature within the radar worked. But I also remember getting back close to finally getting heading to go back to Florida, and it was black. Of course, it's 10:30 in the morning. I think it was midnight. And when we got back and close to the land, and comes on the radio, and the controller says, "Hey, what are your intentions?" And John says, "We want to land at Patrick." And the guy says, "Well, you can't land there because the crosswind is too severe. In fact, we had a Canadian plane land earlier and ran off the runway." So there's this pause for a little bit, and controller says, "Well, what are your intentions?" And John says, "We're going to fly this pig over the first available land, and we're all bailing out." And the controller got a little excited and said, now just a minute. He said, "If you think you can handle the kind of crosswind they had," I think it was 25 to 35 knots, so be it. But, I want to go on record as telling you that you are outside the landing limits or conditions. In any event, thank God, it looked like we were landing on an alternate runway with the amount of crab that you had, and here we are bouncing down the runway, fortunately, and there were 10 guys, I believe, on that flight, and a number of us, including me, got out and kissed that runway when we finally shut it down. It was an experience that, fortunately, we were able to survive. And I remember, I think we class 26 the airplane, and the next day we basically flew north and then over to New Orleans and flew right up the Mississippi and got it home. But I should have kept a diary like you did, because it was a mental mark in my imagination that has forever been there. And I was happy to get your note and be able to finally see you after 25 years and recollect a hell of an experience. The issue of what did we do after we landed at 10:30 or 11 is kind of interesting. I recall getting in a van and going to a motel and literally going to sleep, and of course in the middle of the day, and waking up maybe later, 5 o'clock or 6. And I'm sure we had after our system settled down or something, we had a few beers, but it was Saturday, I believe, and here we are sleeping at 10:30 or 11:30 in the morning, and that was just a reaction to shock, I'm sure, because we were all numb by, there wasn't there was very little talking, there was no, screwing around at all. It was an experience that everybody was very, very happy to have had behind them, and also very happy to have had a successful outcome. So it's one that I'll never forget, and I think it's great that you're pulling this all together.
Well, Gary, the thing that always kind of concerned me is I told people that we were flying needle-bound airspeed, and people have told me that no one does that anymore. But I had an old instructor that used to have a cardboard disc that he put over the attitude indicator and make me fly needle-bound airspeed back in the old days. And I remember that the RMI cards were gone, were inaccurate, and the reason they were gone is because the flux gate compass out in the left wing, it's a little spider. I don't know if I put that down in the notes or not, but that was physically broken off. So none of the repeaters made any good. And then at DG, remember that directional gyro, that big thing? That was just spinning at, whatever RPM the thing was going. And then John told me, or somebody told me, the inverters were out. So the attitude indicator was erratic. And then you tell me that the Loran wasn't working.
That was gone.
And if we were in the schmuck, did you have anything to navigate by?
No, we were really working right off of that whiskey compass. That's all we had.
And
their vector. I had nothing.
Okay, and the whiskey compass, is totally erratic with acceleration and deceleration and that sort of thing. We were really frickin' lucky.
Oh yeah, we were, because we had, fortunately we were able to get it back and, get a vector back, and he would tell us whether we were on the vector or not. I mean,
Yeah, we had this no gyro approach.
Right.
Now this is the way we should have done this whole thing. I was under the impression that the GCI-A site, the GC ground control approach site, was wiped out. And this guy was a center operator, a GCI site, ground control intercept. Remember that used to you guys in the fighters? Is that wrong?
I don't remember that.
So I got the idea that he gave us a GCA from a distant point, which makes it all the more. He was a GCI operator giving us a GCA, and he was not on the site, so he did a really outstanding job. And I remember it's taken so long to get down. I mean, we were up around 14,000 feet, and the approach, we were motionless. They came back and said, you've been stationary for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, that means... And on the way down the hill, the thing seemed to settle down.
Yeah.
But from my old fighter pilot days, they have that envelope up there that when you get up real high, as your stall speed comes down, and what do they call that? That envelope where if you increase your speed, you go through your Mach number, and the wings will come off. And if you slow down, you'll go through your stall, and then you'll fall out of the sky, and the wings will come off. Either way, you're absolutely screwed.
Right.
And so, on that descent, the speed, the airspeed indicator was indicating well over 200 knots. And we weren't moving over the ground.
Yeah.
And then I remember Hank coming up and laying on the right side, looking through for the runway. And Alberio came up. He was upgrading Lester or something like that in the engineer seat.
I remember Jose.
And he laid in the left, and those two guys and you were standing up looking over the shoulder, looking for the damn runway.
Yeah.
That was really...
Yeah, it was. I remember the only thing I remember when we got down and we met that Lester. We met him. He
Yeah.
was at the ops.
Oh, that center operator.
That
Okay.
center operator showed up, and he had taken a Polaroid picture of the screen. I remember looking at that.
I never saw that.
Yeah, and it was absolutely, totally, this big blot on one side of the screen with this hook underneath it. And we were in the middle of that, and it turned out, in his opinion, it was really a tornado part of a front that went through with a tornado in it because the hook was right in there. So
'Cause I remember when we tried to turn off, I think we did a couple of 360s before we got out of there because, they kept referring to us as uncontrollable airplane in the area.
Yeah. And
and when they got down afterwards, I remember that's when they redlined this thing because they took the panels, and they saw that inside plates and shear pins and stuff had broken, and I didn't know that at the time. And then John declassified it from a red X to a red dash so we could get home. That's pretty interesting.
yeah. All I know is that it was it was an experience that it was out of my flying time with North Dakota Guard and training and all those things. It was the most memorable.
You flew 94s and 89s?
89s, yeah.
But that's got to be scary in itself.
Well, yeah. You talk about flying those F-89s. So the old fun part of that is that you used to take them up to 50,000 feet and then just let them fall out of the sky, and they'd right themselves at about 25 or 30,000 feet.
You're kidding.
No, so that was kind of fun.
Oh,
Do some crazy stuff with that, but this tumble was almost akin to that because it felt like here you are in a C-119 pretending you're an acrobatic fighter.
Yeah.
And
we were extremely lucky.
yeah,
When I got out, I remember one thing. We approached the airplane the next morning because I didn't even remember what time it was, but it must have been about 10:30 in the morning when we got there, but it was dark.
Yeah, it was.
It was dark. Yeah, but when we come up the next morning, the sun was shining on that C-130, or C-119, and it looked like when I used to make the wooden airplanes with the paper, and if you get them too wet, how it dries, it sucks in, and you can see all the
Yeah, you can see the ribs.
You see the ribs?
Yeah.
You could see the ribs of this airplane.
Yeah, I don't remember that, but jeez, it wouldn't surprise me because it was.
Oh, I tell you, here's a couple more that I've heard from different guys. Is that we had lunches, we had box lunches, and nobody ate them.
Oh,
I
no.
mean, when we left the airplane, things were just left set there. And the next morning when they came there, that the cream in the creamer, they had real cream in those. They had churned into butter. There's no kidding. The tomatoes that smashed up against the ceiling, there was nothing left but the skins. And then, you know, with the steps that went up the flight deck, there was a little box underneath there,
Yeah.
like toolbox.
Yeah.
Somebody hid a couple of bottles of whiskey to get through customs, or whatever we did from Puerto Rico, or whatever we'd go through.
Yeah.
And there was nothing but ground glass in there.
That's for sure.
So that's absolutely amazing.
Yeah. There was. Yeah, the G-forces were really. It's too bad we didn't measure them because they were just about the max of what any airplane could have withstood.
So we were lucky.
You'd slip the surly bonds of earth and dance the sky on laughter's silvered wings. We did things you've never dreamed of. We chased the shouting wind along and flung our plane through footless halls of air, where never even lark or eagle flew. And we, with silent lifting mind, trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space and put out our hands and touched the face of God.